Hello Internet, my name is Ben, and today I'd like to talk to you about the news. So in response to my last video, my friend Chris asked me the question, why can't the news be this nonpartisan? Now I'm sure he thought that was a rhetorical question when he asked it, but I believe that rhetorical questions are an illegitimate form of question. I'm kidding. Or am I? I don't know. Either way. Wait, what were we talking about? So I'm gonna answer it for him. Here's why American TV news can never be nonpartisan. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to say about the news is that the news is invaluable. Like I would have never known about the situation in Mali, or the US debt, or really anything that happens outside of my local community without some form of news. Like seriously. Go try to figure out the political situation in Pakistan without using the news. I'll wait here while you fly halfway around the world and learn Urdu. But you need to know about the political situation in Pakistan because it's all wrapped up with our war in Afghanistan and our relationship with India, and also they've got nukes. The news gives us information, and we need information. But I think it's important to understand how and why we get the news we get and why it can never be nonpartisan. I also want to point out that our relationship with the news has changed dramatically in the last 50 years. But we'll get to that later. So now why the news can't be nonpartisan. Okay, so I'm going to talk primarily about American television news because most Americans still get their news from the TV. Also, the example of TV news fits my oversimplified narrative the best. So American news programs are designed to be two things. First, to be entertaining, and second, and more importantly, to be profitable. Quick side note, there's nothing wrong with for-profit companies. Like, they make almost all of my favorite things. Like this camera, for instance. I wouldn't be able to make the videos without it. But thinking of the news as a kind of consumer product can be problematic, which we'll talk about back over here. So television news makes its money the same way that any other television program makes its money, through the sale of ads. And to make money selling ads, you need to have a large audience. And it's obviously easier to maintain that audience than it is to build it from scratch. So generally what you do is you find an audience that's already identified, and then you deliver them their news in the way they want it to be delivered to them. People tune into specific television shows because they have an expectation of what they're going to see. If you meet that expectation, they're going to be happy, and if you don't, then they're not going to watch your show. Here's a non-news example. Remember that Fox show Terra Nova where they went back to dinosaur times so the human race could start over? People tuned into that show because they wanted to see people with machine guns fighting dinosaurs, but they never fought dinosaurs with machine guns, and it was terrible! How could you mess that up? And then the show got canceled after its first season? That's the kind of thing that can happen if a television show doesn't meet its audience's expectations. So to build and maintain your audience and keep making money, you need to meet expectations, you need to be consistent. And this is critical for keeping a loyal audience. You have to keep meeting those expectations. Like if I tune in to watch my favorite crime drama and without any explanation it's now a cooking show where all the characters are puppets, or it's set in the distant past but they never fight dinosaurs, then I am going to change the channel because that's not what I tuned in to see. I tuned in to watch attractive people outsmart and then catch uncomplicated villains, and trust me, I can find that elsewhere. So speaking of uncomplicated heroes and villains, let's talk about narrative structure and how TV news is made interesting. So there are lots of ways to organize information narratively, and narrative restructuring is a kind of thing that we have to do as human beings to understand things. Humans are much better at remembering and understanding narratives than they are at understanding or remembering just random pieces of data, which is why you're more likely to remember the dinner you had on a first date years ago than you are to remember what you had for dinner 10 days ago. Your dinner during the date was part of your first date narrative, but without any special meaning attached to it. Your dinner 10 days ago is just a random piece of information that your brain just didn't hold on to. Your brain needs to structure information into narratives if you want to remember it, or if you want it to make sense to you. Side note number 2, our brains often screw up our own memories when we try to fit our lives into narratives. These guys called Neisser and Harsch did a really interesting study on it based on Flashbulb memories and the Challenger explosion, and they published a pretty important book on it. I'll put some links in the video description if you're interested. So organizing your thoughts, you can pick from a bunch of different narrative structures. Like for instance, the Aristotelian idea that good stories are made when highborn people fall victim to their tragic flaws and are brought low, like in the story of Oedipus or Paris Hilton. But of course, telling the story that way changes it. First, you have to believe that there's some sort of a thing called a highborn person, and you have to think that people's fates are determined on some level by their morality. And I'm sure you've noticed, like for instance in The Great Gatsby or on Earth, that if there is such thing as a highborn or noble person, that when they act poorly, they don't always get what's coming to them. But most of our cultural narrative and most of our news is styled as an epic. So you may know the style of an epic through such notable examples as Beowulf or Star Wars or the Legends of King Arthur. No. Yes, there you go. There are high stakes and expansive settings and powerful villains and heroes that represent our cultural values, etc. Side note number 3. I did some research when I was an undergrad about how framing stories this way can lead to the creation of conspiracy theories. To quote historian William Manchester, "Those who desperately want to believe that President Kennedy was the victim of a conspiracy have my sympathy. I share their yearning." To employ what may seem an odd metaphor, there's an aesthetic principle here. If you put 6 million dead Jews on one side of a scale and on the other side put the Nazi regime, the greatest gang of criminals ever to seize control of a modern state, you have a rough balance. Greatest crime, greatest criminals. But if you put the murdered President of the United States on one side of a scale and that wretched waif Oswald on the other side, it doesn't balance. You want to add something weightier to Oswald. It would invest the President's death with meaning, endowing him with martyrdom. He would have died for something. And a conspiracy would, of course, do the job nicely. So you can already imagine how organizing the news into epic narratives can cause problems. First of all, there always has to be clear heroes and villains, and like I mentioned in my Mali video, The world doesn't always organize itself that way. Epic stories don't really have space for that kind of ambiguity. Plus, there's the issue of scale. Like, not every story can be the greatest threat to America ever. But you hear this all the time in American TV news. If a pundit says, if we don't fix the debt, we're gonna end up like Greece. Well, that's ridiculous. There's lots of complicated reasons why Greece is in the situation it's in now, and there's lots of reasons that's not gonna happen here in the United States. Watch my last video. But an epic narrative needs those kinds of consequences. And what I think is even more troubling in this example, and all news being told as epics, is that for every we, there needs to be an equally powerful they, who both wants to stop you and who has the power to stop you. So basically, to tell an epic story, you need to have A, two similarly sized or equally powerful groups who are B, able to oppose one another, C, have easily definable leaders who share their followers' core values, that D, have a long-running story you can tell consistently. I mean, all the key elements of an epic are there in abundance in the American political system. The scope is vast in both time and space. Political representatives almost definitionally have the same values as their core supporters. And because there's so much money invested in the two-party political system, there's almost no way that one party could ever come to totally dominate over the other. So you can just keep on telling the same story forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. The only problem for this narrative structure is it means that there always has to be something important on the line. Like I've said before, there's lots of complicated geopolitical reasons why things happen, but that's not a good story. A good story is things are bad because of bad people, and if you, me, and other good people like us don't do something now, everything's gonna be bad forever. Hurry, let's go! But thinking like this can have really serious real-life consequences. Like when you start looking at your political rivals as enemies instead of as other citizens with slightly different views who also want what is best for your shared country, things can get kind of bad. Another big problem for the news media is consistency. And like I said before, consistency is very important, both for making a show profitable and for making it entertaining. So if I have a show about banana salesmen, and it's about how banana salesmen are the best fruit sellers who sell the best fruit, my show needs to be about that every day. Stories about bananas being good is what my show is about, and what my audience tunes in expecting to see. So if I wake up in the morning and there's a report out that bananas cause cancer, I still have a show to make, and that show is still about how bananas are good. But this is a huge problem for me, so what do? I still have to go on air, so maybe I go on air and say, you know who this report's been really good for is those sneaky apple sellers. No, I'm not saying they're the ones who started this rumor, but... And see, this is the kind of thing that TV news programs have to do if they want to stay in business. They need to be entertaining and they need to be profitable, so they have to take the news and fit it into their narrative regardless of what the news actually says. And this need for consistency is bad, not only because it skews the truth, but it also reinforces the idea that the stakes are always high because there's always this other out there who is trying to stop you. So if I have a TV news program on Fox News, it has to be about how Democrats are bad or Republicans are good every single day. And if I have a television program on MSNBC, it has to be about how Democrats are good and Republicans are bad every single day. I need to sell a product that consumers want every day. Otherwise, I will no longer have a television news program anymore. My show will be canceled, and I will be reduced to making videos on the internet. But backing off from my rant a little bit, I understand why people want these narratives in their news, and like William Manchester, I sympathize. Everybody wants their lives to be part of a meaningful struggle, with good guys to root for and uncomplicated bad guys to defeat, but that's not always the case, and simple narratives are rarely true. And that is why the news in the US can never be nonpartisan, Chris. Take that, rhetorical questions! Side note number 4, the UK mitigates this to an extent by getting most of their news from BBC, and BBC, while it is a for-profit company, is first and foremost a royal charter company. And they've been bound by royal charter since their founding in 1926 to report unbiased and non-partisan news, which is apparently the kind of thing you can do if you live in a 1,000-year-old monarchy with crazy traditions. Like seriously, the 2006 version of the BBC's royal charter starts like this. Elizabeth II, by the grace of God of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and of all other realms and territories, Queen, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, to all whom these presents shall come greeting. I'm sorry, that just makes me really happy for some reason. So on the way back to America, remember way back at the beginning of this video when I said that our relationship with the news had changed significantly in the last 50 years? Well, roll the clip.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
That's taken from Walter Cronkite's report from Vietnam in 1968. That report is famous because it essentially ended U.S. public support for the war in Vietnam. A lot of media historians point to this moment as the turning point in the relationship between the U.S. and its media. See, the news media, because it only reports on certain things, has always to a certain extent determined what we think about. But in this moment, the news changed, from telling us not only what to think about, but also how to think about it. And this expectation for newscasters to editorialize the news has fundamentally changed the way that we take in information. I think that's worth thinking about. Thanks for watching. If you thought this video was entertaining or informative, let me know in comments or on Facebook. Also like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any ideas for what I should explain next, I'm open to suggestions. Oh, and try to get your news from multiple sources. I can tell you as a historian, when there are multiple competing narratives, the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. Peace.